Hey everybody, so I've built another electric bike here. So this is pretty much all custom. Started with a Northrock XC00 that you can get at Costco for about 300 bucks. And I pretty much proceeded to go and replace almost everything that isn't the frame on this bike. This is 750 watt geared hub motor, Bafang. This is the new G06 750 watt motor. So this is not the same as the G60, which is very confusing because Bafang made two of these 750 watt geared hub motors, and this is the later model. I'm not exactly sure how different they are. I heard Lithium Cycles say that it's been renovated, whether it's tougher and more durable and beefy and everything. I assume so. So the thing is, this bike is different than the other bike I've built. I also have a Golden Motor Edge direct drive bike. This is considerably different, and the low end power is kind of astonishingly more aggressive than the other bike. So it's 250 watts more power, but there is a considerable amount of hill climbing ability this bike has over the other one. I've gone to some little BMX tracks, and you can park the bike at the bottom of a kind of a slight hill, and the direct drive can't get up it at all. This thing just tears right up it. So that's kind of why I wanted to build this bike. The interesting thing is, with the extra 250 watts, the bike is still the same top speed. This might be even quicker. So I'm getting a lot of low end, and the top end is better as well. So one of the things that I really wanted to get sorted out on this bike, and every e-bike I've ridden, the throttle is crazy on all of them. It's really jumpy and out of control. So I've got several custom things that are a little bit different than most other e-bikes, in that I have a two-stage switch here, basically. I mean, the switch is just an aftermarket switch. You have to wire it all up yourself. My controller doesn't have the ability to switch between high and low power modes. When you get 750 watts, it's powerful enough where you're going to really want to be able to put it in a mode where it's not so jumpy. So when I flip this switch, I get considerably less power. So when I'm navigating on boardwalks where there's people walking around, it's not jumpy at all. And I'm using a twist grip throttle, and that works fine. This is just a generic twist grip. So the circuit for how to wire that up, you got to know what you're doing with electronics a little bit, and get in there and wire in a voltage divider circuit into the throttle leads that come out of the throttle. I'll put up a graphic on that and show you what I did, and found something online that's I kind of stole from them that idea, redid it because this bike seems to be very different with its controller. But a couple, the things that make this bike different is also I've got cruise control hooked up to this green button. It's a horn button on this thing. This top doesn't do anything, but the horn button just turns cruise control on and off. A lot of people don't think cruise control has any value. I need it with this bike because I commute to the beach, which is a 6-mile straight line ride on a river trail where there's usually nobody on it, and I just want to get to speed, hit the button, and then you don't have to have your hand continuously sitting there on the throttle. So I've owned motorcycles in the past, and I've never had any desire for a motorcycle to have a cruise control on it ever, and I've done pretty good rides with that. For some reason with these e-bikes, I just rather would have a cruise control, and it's easy to wire up. A lot of controllers do it. It's going to depend on the controller you've got. So the controller I have is a 35 amp sine wave controller. I was very picky about it being a sine wave. It's just you get more power out of the sine wave controller, and it's a quieter kind of power. It's not a square wave signal going to the motor, it's a sine wave. And you get more power out of it, which is nice. And the sine wave controllers aren't even that expensive. So another thing I really did want to get with my own bike is some way to cover up all the craziness going on in the middle of the bike. I've seen a lot of people have trouble figuring out where to put the controller, and I have my battery and my controller's under this stainless steel simple little cover that I built with went to Home Depot, got some sheet metal, bent it over a 2x4, which is the width of the controller, and it kind of hides everything, and it gives the bike more of like a motorcycle look where that middle part's covered. But the other advantage is, since this is just a flat piece of metal, it breathes pretty well because air can come in through there and go out the back. So I can take it off here really easily. Initially I thought I was going to use riv nuts to hold it down, but in mocking it up, I just had 2 pieces of Velcro that I have inside of here that hold it on, and that easily works perfectly. So I don't have any issues with the thing coming off or moving or anything. So I've seen a lot of people struggle with where to put the controller, and I've always known that I want it above the battery. And it's ugly, and when you cover it up, it looks nice and clean, and it protects the wires to some degree. The other problem I had is I have to rack this bike because sometimes I want to go on a longer trip where I'm further away with the bike, and I have to be able to shove the rack right through this spot right here. So this popping right off with Velcro is so simple, and no tools, nothing required, and you can rack the bike. I got 1 post going here, 1 going in there, no problem at all. So I've kept a couple other things sort of the same on this bike, but there's so much of it's totally different. I guess the other thing that makes this bike different than most of the other ones I've seen people build is that everybody ends up with the hand controls that are a little bit lesser quality. Like there's a shifter that you see everyone has that's this big thing that sits way up there that the Rad Rover has. The quality of that shifter is terrible. It's one of the cheapest Shimano tourney type shifters you can get. So I had rapid fire shifters before, and I was just committed to finding a way to get an all-in-one to work on this bike. And I found the Shimano EF500 has just enough clearance. You can see that the problem with these all-in-ones is usually when you pull this down, by the time it finally shifts, you're usually too close. So I just got a Dremel and drilled out some of the plastic there. I just did a little bit of gentle drilling there on the actual thumb throttle itself. So this works then, and the quality of this shifter is considerably better than so many of these e-bikes. If you look at what one they're using, they're all using the same one. It's the same one that's on Rad Rover and a bunch of other e-bikes, because it's the only thing that usually fits. So the downside of that is, if you're going to put an all-in-one brake and shift mechanism in, you lose the cutout. Like on this side, I still have the Wuxing normal e-bike brake lever that has its own cutout wire, so that when the motor's going, when you hit the brake, it cuts the motor out, which is essential, especially when you have cruise control, because you do want to kill the cruise control when you grab those brakes. You don't want to have to, hit some other button or cancel the motor somehow. So I had to do an aftermarket magnetic release. This looks kind of crappy here, but there's a magnet here. So when I pull the brakes, the magnet moves away from the sensor. And I got this from Lithium Cycles, and it's made for their one of their kits as well. And you only need one of them because you only need to do it to this one side, because most kits come with their own brake killing grips on them. But this allows me to use this all-in-one, and it's worth it to me because the quality of the shifting is so much better. This works fine. I'm sure I can come up with a more elegant looking solution for this. This is just kind of mocked up to see how it will work, and it seems to be working great. But the other thing is, I'm actually not a fan of having a display on the bike. The display usually for these kits is worthless. The speed never is right. You have to calibrate it, and it's a little bit weird. The battery indicator is no better than any other battery indicator light system. And the information it gives me, I don't care about. I don't care about a trip meter or any of this stuff. This motor controller kit is an Ifunmodi, and it came with the display and all that. I just don't use it. The beauty of this motor controller kit is that you can use it either with or without the display. I like without. I've also got a phone holder and all kinds of other junk I want to put on here. It just gets in the way to have a display. And honestly, I don't care how fast I'm going. I don't care what the trip is because I know where I'm riding. It's just one of these things that personally I don't need it. Other people seem to live without their little display. I'm not like that. I just don't feel like I need it at all. But another thing I did with this is, for the gauges, for the battery level, I just wanted to find a level that had the most little notches on it possible. This thing isn't even configured for lithium batteries. It's configured for lead acid batteries. So the curve of the discharge speed of a lead acid is very different. But with all these electric bikes, you don't really know how good your last charge was sometimes. I mean, depending on temperature and all this other stuff, you have to just get used to whatever your lighting system is for your battery indicator. people keep saying, oh, the controller, the displays are better at keeping those an indication of the battery level. I don't really think it is. You really get a plenty of information from one of these cheap type battery indicator controllers, but you got to watch it. Like on this bike, I know I'm at about half charge when I'm not accelerating at all and the top light is off. That's about half. And then you can also get a sense of how close you are to dead when you look at this level, because there's a bunch of lights when you are on full throttle. So there's a huge voltage sag, and seeing how far the voltage sags when you get on full throttle, you can really tell how much battery you really got left. But this is going to be a preference thing where some people really need that display there with their battery level and speed and all that other stuff. I don't like it. I like a simpler cockpit with just a primitive LED lighting thing for the battery indicator. But with this bike itself, you run into all the problems you do with all these electric bikes, and that you really want to change everything. So I've gone through, I've had the bike in a simple format a long time ago. The more I use it, the more I want to change stuff. Like the first thing I did is got rid of the front shock with, I wanted to get a suspension. This bike came with a rigid front, and I had to get a suspension shock. I got the cheapest one I could find because I wasn't sure what I really wanted. I think probably the best shock to go with is probably the Luna Lander from Lithium Cycles. That everyone raves about it for the price and value you get. So I went with something like this just to get an idea of what I might want. A Passat, I got it on, I think, $90 online. And it's kind of what you would expect. But I am able to keep, had to buy another hub because my old rims were a little bit different. They were a little narrower. With these tires, these are 4-inch wide tires. They're not the huge 5-inch wide that you would see on a Sondors original bike. I like this in-betweener size because I do go to the beach a lot, and I do cruise over beach sand in this bike, and these tires are wide enough where you can, with the throttle in this bike, you can cruise over deep, soft beach sand, and it does work. I don't really need the full, big, giant 5-inch wide tires, but this seems to work really well. And I like a rim that's wider than the narrower rims. I think these are 80 or 90 millimeters wide, the rim itself, and I like how it really is most of the width of the tires almost taken up by the rim. So the rim seems to be appropriately sized for the width of the tire. But had to spoke the wheel myself, which isn't hard at all, and find a hub that would fit with all this. But the other thing is, this bike came with no fenders at all. These are plastic fenders. They're from motorcycles made in the 70s, I think. So I think it's called ARMA or something like that. If you go on eBay and search for motorcycle fenders, you can find some that are almost perfect for this wheel diameter. So with both of these, since motorcycles actually have a smaller wheel, this is another plastic one, works great on this. You have to radius the plastic to the wheels. So what I did for this is I got a heat gun and put these on the tire, heated them up. The plastic gets really flexible, and then I let it cool while it was on the tire. So I got the exact radius of the wheel, and that came out really well. So I really wanted a bike that has some fenders on it. It's better to have something there that can control the dirt and mud and all that junk that gets kicked up. But if you're looking specifically at building a kit with a Northrock XC00, the first thing everyone really has a problem with is the gearing is very strange on it. And I think it's a great bike to use. It's not expensive, and it's a good value for the money. It's for $300 you're getting a decent frame, and it's aluminum. It's pretty light. It's a fairly light bike out of the stock. But I replaced the whole gearing assembly here, and the funny thing is the crank arms were 155 millimeters, very short. So I'm very tall. These are 175 millimeter Shimano crank arms, and I also went with a narrow wide gear chain there, gear sprocket, because I need to climb hills with it. When I'm at full speed, this thing is a monster. I'm never going super fast, so I've geared it to go slow, and I've picked a freewheel that has a pretty steep first gear so I can get up hills. And the nice thing about this bike is it comes with an Altus derailleur, which is a little better than all the turny derailleurs out there. So it shifts really good. I mean, I'm not super demanding. I'm not competing. I'm not doing any downhill stuff. So I just want a bike that's generally going to stay together, and I can do my own maintenance. So this type of thing really seems to work out really well. But I was a little nervous when I got this originally because the frame is 170 millimeters wide dropout in the back. But the Bafang is a 175 millimeter width. And I'm like, well, I'm going to give it a chance. And I'm spreading this rear frame 5 millimeters. It's already so wide to begin with. 5 more probably isn't that big of a deal. The angles probably aren't that bad, but that seems to be working fine. Like I said, though, I'm not doing super hardcore heavy stuff, so it's going to hold up, I think, well. And as usual, got rid of the original seat. This is the Bikeroo. Much more comfortable because I'm cruising generally. And what other stuff have I done to this thing? It's just about everything. So the front stem here, it's a threadless stem, and it was originally sticking way out and the bars were much further forward. I like sitting upright much more. So I've just got a different stem to pull the bars back, and I also bought different bars that had a little bit of a rise in them so I can sit up kind of more upright even. But it's kind of a large frame size. I'm an extra large, I guess, need because I'm 6'2", and it's pretty good. It's a good balance. I could go a little higher on the bars. When I replaced the fork, I didn't cut the stem, the steer tube that much. I cut it a little bit, but you can see I've got a nice stack of spacers between there. So I think this is a compromise between it being comfortable and it looking kind of okay. So it's sort of right in between there. But the battery is the same one I use in my Golden motor. I just swap it. And I guess the trick with the battery is for all these e-bikes, you really want to mount the battery, and you can drill directly into the metal holder of the battery. So let me show you exactly what that is. Okay, now with the battery removed, this thing is a little flexible up here, so I kind of need that to push it up. But all that's really holding my controller in is I have a metal tab that goes into a bottle cage boss that was originally there. I've got that screwed in, and then all I have holding the top on is a zip tie. And I'm a huge believer in Velcro everywhere. I used to use zip ties to hold wiring, but I'm the kind of person that's usually changing the wiring and moving things around. And personally, the Velcro, it's more comfortable because you're going to bang around on your bike a lot and hit it with your body. The zip ties are like little razor blades that'll just cut you bloody pretty quickly. So the nice thing about the Velcro is you can just endlessly reposition things and move things around, and it's soft, it doesn't damage the bike, and it won't cut you to pieces. But the thing about the battery, to mount the battery, you know, you have this tray that you got to put on a bike. So usually the bottle cage bosses, there's usually one around the bottom area, and this metal plate, you can screw directly through it into the original bottle cage boss that came with the bike, and that definitely holds the back part of it on really well. But usually you don't have anything holding the front part. So up here, you can use a riv nut gun, which you can buy at Harbor Freight or someplace. They're pretty cheap, like 20 bucks, and it comes with threaded rivets that you pop in. You have to drill a hole, and then you pop in a rivet that has threads in it that you can screw these metric sized screws into to hold this in there. So it's absolutely rigidly in there. It's not going anywhere ever. It's about how they do the bottle cage bosses. It looks exactly the same when you're done. So with that in there, it's very well held in, and it's nice to have it right in the middle. It's nice to get your controller out of the way, because I see a lot of people putting the controller in a bag. I need the bag for other storage and tools and junk when I'm riding these long distances. If I have a blowout, I need a patch kit and some other stuff. But the other thing I do with all these electric bikes is I wire in a step-down transformer. So on a bike, you pretty much have to have 5 volts USB connectors. So I haven't even hooked mine up to anything yet, but I've got 2 normal USB plugs on the back here that go to this step-down transformer. So you can buy these for like 20-25 bucks on eBay or something like that, and they're wired directly into the power leads that come out of the battery. So with that, this bike doesn't have the lights on it yet, but I can have a rear light permanently wired to these USB things. And then I can drag another USB cable up to the front and have a front headlight permanently wired to the main battery. So even if you're not doing that and you don't have ride at night, it's good to have a 5-volt system on here with USB, so you can charge your phone. If you get lost, you're in the middle of nowhere or something and your battery's dead, you can just charge your phone right up, no problem with it. So the funny thing about the batteries is a lot of them come with a little USB port on the side. Unfortunately, that kind of gets in the way of your legs going back and forth. You don't really want anything sticking out at all. Even though you can get these 90-degree adapters, it really doesn't work. And a lot of these batteries have that disconnected or non-functional in some weird way, or the voltage is too low to power any real accessory. So it's just better to kind of do it yourself. It's a little bit of a block. You've got to wire up into the bike, but it's easy. So I mean, you can kind of see from the mess of the wires that you're gonna have to know what you're doing if you're gonna build this kit. I mean, there's a lot of wires up here. You have to have a decent understanding of electronics just to figure it out. But this is kind of what you go through. So, I mean, people look at this and say, why don't you just buy like a juice bike or a Rad Rover? I could, but this ends up being a little bit cheaper. I save about 300 bucks, but the key thing is I get exactly what I want. I mean, I kind of am picky about the way things look. I think the Rad Rover looks a little bit different than I would like, and I like straight frame. I don't know why, but the bars to me look good when they're straight. And I endlessly customize stuff anyways. Even if I bought a Rad Rover, I would have been messing around with it for quite a while. But I think that's, you know, if I had to buy one, it would probably be the Rad Rover or the juice bike. So there's a bunch of makers now coming out with really cheap stuff, like Lithium Cycles has the Super 73, which looks really fun. So the key thing to me is it's difficult to find a fat tire bike that has suspension. I mean, now the Sondors, you can get it as an option, and Juice Bikes has it, and Rad Rover has it. There's just a lot more options these days, and I'm kind of mechanical kind of person. I kind of am curious about how these things work anyways, so I figured I'd just go and build it myself. At the end, I guess it probably cost me about $12.50 to build this whole thing. I mean, the battery, of course, is like 400 bucks. It's the most expensive component of this whole system. The rear motor, the hub motor I got from Unicycle, which can run you, I don't know, 250 or something like that, 220. And then the controller was, I think, 120, and that's kind of because I'm picky and I want a sine wave controller. And these pretty much the basic set of features does exist for these commercial bikes. And you know, I also felt it was easier to just not have a bike shipped across the world to get to me and all that stuff. I kind of had this bike already. This is another reason I built it myself. I already had the Northrock bike and I was using it for a while and I really did like it. So I'm like, yeah, let me just slap all these components on there, and it worked out really well. But that's pretty much it. I mean, I guess like I was saying before, the key things that make this different, I hadn't really seen too many people covering, you know, putting the controller above the battery, which is such an obvious place to put it. And, you know, covering it with this simple piece of sheet metal that just drops in over there is such an easy idea. I hadn't seen that happening in a lot of the home-built bikes. But, I mean, the key thing, if this bike has one thing that's really different than most of the other ones, it's being able to physically switch the power. Even the ones that have the controller where you can switch your power levels, you have to go into a menu and push a button or hit something to get to a different power level, and then you don't know which one you're in. You got to look at the screen to visibly get that verification. To me, it's easier to have a switch that I don't have to look at anything. I'm riding along, I can just hit a switch and be in a different power level. I know what that means. That's low power, that's high power. Really simple. It's the simplest possible way to do it. But this was also a big find. Figuring out what shifter would work comes with the downside of losing the integrated motor killer brake. I'll put a link in the description at the bottom for how the voltage reducer works. So for a couple e-bikes I built, I definitely want this because the bikes are too jumpy, especially when you get over 500 watts. The bike is hard to control at low speed because the electric power comes on so quick. So this circuit is pretty common for these aftermarket electric bike controllers, and that all the controller does is it's sending voltage to the controller from the throttle. There's 3 wires coming out of the throttle on most of these electric bike throttles. It's just sending between 1.5 and 5 volts to the controller to let it know what position the throttle's at. So when you're trying to go ride in a way that reduces the power, what you can do with this setup is they have a switch on the top right. You can see the single pole switches in there, and when it's engaged, you can dial in the amount of reduction of the throttle that you want with the potentiometer. In their case, they're using 5K potentiometer. I found that 50K resistor works ideally in my setup. I don't know why it's so different, but in the electronics for 2 controllers I've had, they both want a 50K resistor there. So what happens when you can flip the switch and everything's just like normal with the bike, but when you hit the switch the other way, it's going to reduce the voltage coming out of that controller. So normally full throttle would be 5 volts maybe. When this circuit's active, you might only be getting 2 volts out of the throttle system telling the controller. So basically what it's doing is full throttle becomes something that's much closer to part throttle. And the reason they had this original schematic with a potentiometer here is on the top right, you can dial in how much reduction you want. So the only downside to this is when you reduce the voltage, it's also reducing the voltage on the low end of the throttle. So you want to kind of correct for that by having another potentiometer. There's another in the bottom left, that blue thing, the 5K potentiometer there. They call it a trimmer. It is a way to bring the voltage back up. So it sounds strange, but you're knocking voltage down across the board, and then you're bringing it back up so that you can have your beginning twist of the throttle start to move you right away. Because if you don't, you won't get anything to happen until you're almost at the very end of the throttle. So it's a little bit of a complicated circuit, but it really does. The nice thing about the way I've wired it up in my bike is it's all removable. So if I don't like it for whatever reason, I can just unplug the different connections I've got. So on my bike, I have that switch on the top left handlebar that switches between this circuit being in and out effectively. It makes the throttle continuously variable, and it's either varying through a lower amount of power or full power. So the only interesting thing about it is that trimmer at the bottom, the blue one, you can trim it so that at 0 throttle, the bike's actually moving. So it can be kind of dangerous to set this circuit up because based on some voltage changes when your battery's fully charged or when the temperature might be cold or hot, the voltage may vary enough where your bike can start to walk and move on its own when this circuit's activated. So it's because you have to make up for that voltage on the low end that you're using, it's a little bit weird. So you've got to kind of be a little careful adopting this thing, but it does allow you to reduce the voltage while you still maintain a complete usage of the full sweep of the throttle. That was a little bit a hard thing to find. But this made my bike much, much more rideable because I do a lot of riding on open trails, but I also ride on boardwalks where there's people right next to me, and I do not want a jumpy throttle with 750 watts of a geared hub motor behind me because you can just knock people over, and it's a little, you end up being it's very difficult to manage the throttle properly. So with this, I'm knocking the full throttle way down. I'm probably only using about 150 or 200 watts when I have the switch flipped, but it makes the bike controllable, whereas before it's not controllable at all. But it's a lot of fun. I've ridden this thing a couple 100 miles, and it's just been great the whole time. No issues whatsoever. The motor, I guess talking about how solid the motor is, I've done some very steep full throttle hill climbs, like about 1,000-foot elevation. And the funny thing was, full throttle just going up the entire hill, I got to the top. The motor really wasn't, it was just warm. It wasn't hot at all. I was afraid the motor might get too hot and overheat, but the controller was struggling. So my controller was very hot. So that's kind of another reason I built the exposed method here. The cover to breathe a little bit better so that this controller can breathe. But it looks like in this setup, if I'm going to blow something out first in heavy uphill riding on steep trails, probably the controller will blow out before the motor, which is good. The controller's cheaper, but I haven't seen even a hint that the motor is going to have a problem. So the motor has been extremely durable, and haven't had any complaints at all about heat or it shutting down or anything like that at all. So I think this bike's pretty well balanced for what I'm doing. I'm not going crazy with it, but a couple times I did push it as hard as you possibly can, going up very, very steep trail roads up in the hills. But pretty interesting. It's a lot of fun to work with these types of bikes. So good luck on your builds, and keep looking out for some new neat ways that you can tweak all these weird controls on these e-bikes. But drop me a note in the comments if you have some other solutions for this. I think what I've gotten here kind of works good, and I like the physical feel of stuff, because I get, maybe that's from riding motorcycles in the past, but I don't want to look at a display for anything. But let me know if you got some other custom things that might work out good, or stuff you see that I've done that you can see a better way to do it. I'd be interested in hearing that.